Okay, this is going to be an overview of Linda Zagzebski's virtue epistemology, or rather, I should say, a little overview of the virtue epistemology question, starring Linda Zagzebski, who's largely the star of virtue epistemology. She's great, actually. I had really the distinctive luck and good fortune to work closely with Linda as a professor in my first little professor gig down at Loyola Marymount, and she had just come out with her book that made her famous. I was actually working pretty closely with her at that time, and it's all pretty interesting and exciting. And to be honest, she really influenced me, and I kind of ended up going in that direction. So, anyways, it says here, explain the main commitments of Linda Zagzebski's virtue epistemology, focusing on the motivational element of virtue. Then I say, how to explain how this view of Zagzebski's does the following things. And I'm going to ask you to compare how her account of knowledge and what it does, how does that compare to some of the other views of knowledge that we've looked at and what they do. That last part I'll kind of give some comment on. The first part's pretty straightforward. It's kind of like the standard philosophy thing to do. Get out on the table some philosophers' philosophy, kind of get into the details a little bit, look at some objections, put some tension on it. So, see if it's any good. So that's what philosophers do. Take a look at the details a little bit. Explain the main commitments. So here, really, with Zagzebski, the main commitment largely just comes out of explaining for her what knowledge requires. In a way, that's what A is asking you here. What are the criteria for knowledge that Zagzebski requires? One thing you might also do is kind of include in this a little bit on her kind of broader strategy, because she really does have like a broader aim in changing the field as a whole, I guess you could say. She's pretty radical in some ways. But, excuse me, she's got an aim kind of unlike internalism or coherentism, for example, to kind of fundamentally change the whole game. So you might say a little something about that. I think some of that comes out in like the machine process product model, this whole turn to the agent-based epistemology, and if nothing else, what turns out to be a big deal in the theory of knowledge are what we would call epistemic motivations on her view. And that looks like that's pretty unique and different. And it doesn't sound radical on its face necessarily, but it's kind of a game changer in some ways. There's been a lot of pushback on that particular aspect of her view. She also defends some very strong connections between epistemology and ethics. She says that epistemology, when properly seen, essentially becomes a subset of ethics. So that's kind of strong too. Okay, so what's her view? Basically, she says that knowledge is a state of true belief that arises out of an act of intellectual virtue. So right there, you want to kind of like unpack this a little bit. The knowledge being a state of true belief, right there, she's saying it's a state of an agent, a state of a person. People have mental states. Knowledge is one of them. Belief is another mental state that people have. Having true belief, being in a state of true belief or believing truly, is another mental state. And here we've got the mental state that would count as knowledge. And it's not enough to be in that mental state just to have a true belief. That true belief has to have arisen from another state of you. Not from a state of the world, but now your true belief has to have arisen from a state of you. Namely, your intellectual virtues. Or let's say this, as the result of an act of intellectual virtue. Now, obviously, we need to know, well, gosh, what is an act of intellectual virtue? That's kind of the whole thing. We're just saying knowledge is a true belief plus that. or a true belief that comes from there, from one of these acts of intellectual virtue. So really here you can see all of the work, really, of defining knowledge is being put on this potent concept of an act of intellectual virtue and what comes from it. So that's the big deal, and she gives a pretty precise definition of that, what an act of intellectual virtue is. Uh, as we recall, see, what does that require? Is like performing the act that the virtuous person would perform in the circumstances. I think we went over this pretty closely in class. Um, there's a characteristic motivation for every act of intellectual virtue, and that's important. The motivational element of any virtue is part of what makes it true that a given act arises out of that virtue, or let's say a given state of the person arises out of the virtue, means in part that it's due to the causal oomph or force of a motivation. The motivational part of the virtues, part of what actually caused this result or this action. So that's definitely part of it. The motivational part of the virtue is also important because that is praiseworthy. If the virtue promotes a good value, the motivational element of that virtue will love, honor, or respect that value, and that's good. It's good to love something that's good. That's kind of Zagzebski's formula there. So if your motive is loving something good, and your motive produces a certain result, that's double good. You've got a good intent that produces the proper outcome of that good intent, which should be something good. So here we've got a lot of resources then to address the value problem. So the arising out of also is very important because a state of true belief that arises from a different cause, not your own active intellectual virtue, but let's say, as in the Gettier case, it arises from these kind of coincidental causal, what people call deviant causal chains, or these kind of lucky coincidences, like we see in Gettier cases. Well, if that's what the state of true belief arises from, then it hasn't arisen from an act of intellectual virtue, and we wouldn't say that Gettier people have knowledge on Zagzebski's criteria for knowledge. And that's exactly the right thing to say, right? That means you didn't fall victim to the Gettier problem if your criteria of knowledge would not entail that those people possess knowledge. The problem raised by Gettier is that the standard JTB account does have the Gettier people satisfying the JTB criteria for knowledge, but since they clearly don't know, those look like bad criteria. So it wouldn't be a problem for criteria of knowledge according to which Gettier people wouldn't count as knowers. It turns out that those are pretty hard criteria to make because you can make different versions of the same Gettier type problem that almost any criteria of knowledge is going to be applicable to. And then you get the same kind of problem. So it's become this challenge to see if you can come up with criteria for knowledge that can't be Gettierized. For example, that can't be achieved by luck. So has Zagzebski done that? Well, she sure might have, because of the arising between the state of true belief and the motivational component of the virtue. If the true belief has to arise from your own act of intellectual virtue, it looks like it can't thereby arise from luck. Or if it arises in that way, it wouldn't have arisen from luck because it came from your own abilities, it came from your own skill, it came from you, not luck. So maybe Zagzebski's found a way to kind of ensconce that tie to the agent and that kind of appropriate tie between like what justifies us, our belief, and what makes our belief true, that avoids the Gettier problem. She also has this really nice discussion of how Gettier problems arise. So she's got a lot to say there. All right. Ultimately is another thing that you might kind of like note some of the kind of interconnections between how she addresses the criteria for knowledge, in B and C here. Really, all of that seems to revolve around the motivational element, which she describes as some version of loving truth. So, looks like that's doing a lot of important philosophical work on her view, the motivational component of the virtue. She also does have the success component of the virtue, so that's there, but certainly the motivation is doing a lot of the work here. So, yeah, so for example, the very same thing that helps us with the Gettier problem, the fact that we can tie the state of true believing to you, rather than things that you've done, rather than to luck, that also seems to be the same kind of thing that gives your state of true believing additional value and addresses the value problem. Because it came from you and your motivations, that seems like we can say there's greater value to having that kind of true belief, one which comes from your own abilities, as opposed to a true belief that comes from luck. So we seem to also get progress on the value problem. Okay, so that's all kind of like talking about Zagzebski's view. Now what am I asking you to do? So compare this to one of the other views. I don't know if I love this part of the question, but I want to have you see what's distinctive and different about her whole approach here, because it really is both become quite influential, and it's brought a whole new set of interests and possibilities for the field here. So one thing that I think would probably be most interesting, and what Zagzebski and a lot of virtue epistemologists have in mind, is to look at how virtue epistemology stands vis-a-vis, or by way of, the internalism-externalism debate. So I might have been better off just asking you to kind of compare it to those. For this reason, virtue epistemology developed in large part to supersede the internalism-externalism debate. It's also true in Sosa's version. I don't know if we really did a lot of Sosa, but I'm sure he's got some entries in our text. He's also one of the big virtue epistemologists, but of the reliabilist sort, which is different from Zagzebski. He actually introduces virtue epistemology to supersede the foundationalism coherentism dialectic or debate. So yeah, I guess that is relevant. I think maybe most interesting here is you could see like how does this virtue epistemology of Zagzebski stand in comparison to the kind of concerns and interests that motivated this debate between internalism and externalism? Does it at least the view is that it picks up on and it keeps the valid concerns of both the internalist and externalist without giving rise to such an extreme theory that we end up with this kind of hardened standoff between internalism and externalism, which is what happened. Really kind of post-Gettier, we got these like two camps, and then internalism and externalism, that just basically couldn't talk to each other. They're like Republicans and Democrats, where there's just too much separation to even have like a meaningful debate. So Zagzebski saw herself as coming in and kind of not flat out rejecting both, but keeping the valid intuitions that there are motivating externalism, keeping the valid intuitions that are there motivating internalism, capturing those in this different theory of virtue epistemology. But we kind of keep what's good in both internalism and externalism. So yay, it's good. Everybody wins. We're not throwing out valid intuitions that lie behind these kind of extreme views. So what was I going to say there? Yeah, I guess that would be mostly the thing to do. And I guess this, if you can point out the internalist element of Zagzebski-style virtue epistemology, that would be good. If you can point out the externalist element of Zagzebski-style virtue epistemology, and then say, this is how she aims to kind of capture both internalist and externalist desiderata, that's good. Also, maybe to kind of wrap this up, this kind of fits with the textbook kind of way of presenting virtue ethics and the resurgence of virtue ethics starting in the 1980s, really with like Philippa Foot's work, which is now really continued. Virtue ethics is, now a kind of a main player in contemporary ethics, even though it's like a very ancient theory that comes from Aristotle. What a lot of people say about the textbook view there, virtue ethics, is that it combines consequentialism in the form of utilitarianism and Kantian deontology in a kind of third different theory that isn't one of these extreme versions of externalism in ethics or internalism in ethics, kind of motive-based or consequence-based, respectively, but it preserves the valid intuitions that lead to extreme theories like utilitarianism or extreme theories like Kant are based on some legit intuitions. And the view with the resurgence of virtue ethics was that virtue theory has the resources to accommodate both of these legitimate concerns into a theory that's neither decidedly or only deontological or consequentialist. And thus we get the best of both worlds. We kind of get this synthesis of two competing lines of philosophy in the now kind of more full or complete virtue theory of ethics, and that gives us a good reason to think that virtue ethics is good. So maybe we get the same kind of story when we look at Zagzebski's virtue epistemology in relation to internalism and externalism in epistemology, as what we would see for virtue ethics vis-a-vis deontology and consequentialism in ethics. And just to kind of leave this, things are getting pretty thick at this point. Internalism and externalism in epistemology appear to have the same normative structure as deontology and consequentialism in ethics do. So it's all kind of starting to fit. All right, so I think I'll kind of leave it there. Lots to think of in the Zagzebski paper, and might be a good, interesting thing to write on for lots of people.